Hello. Yeah, welcome everybody. We heartily welcome Professor Onustub Boshu in today's session. Uh, and today we have two speakers, uh, Professor Onustub Boshu, and then after 1 hour or so, Professor Abhishek Parvi. So uh, we will straight go into the discussion and session today, and our esteemed colleague Partho Pratim Roy Chaudhary will introduce Professor Boshu, and then Professor Boshu will deliver his talk. So Partho, can you please introduce him and just mention the title of his talk, and then we can go live.
Thank you, Shomratna. I sincerely hope I'm audible. Yes. Although it's virtual, yet it's really a great honor to connect with everyone here. We are really grateful and proud that we could bring together so many distinguished and erudite scholars from around the world to have a discussion on humanities beyond disciplines. Yesterday, we had Professor Debashish Banerjee and Professor Anirban Dash. The video is available on YouTube. Today, we are really proud to bring to you Professor Onustub Boshu. He is Associate Professor at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of Hindutva as Political Monotheism, Bollywood in the Age of New Media, and the co-editor of Intermedia in South Asia and Figurations in Indian Film. His essays on film, media, culture, philosophy, and politics have appeared in journals like Boundary 2, Semiotic Inquiry, Journal of Human Rights, Postscript, Postmodern Culture, and Critical Quarterly. He was also executive producer of Harbert, the national award-winning film based on Navarun Bhattacharya's novel. This evening, Professor Boshu has agreed to speak on affect, neuroscience, and the humanities. Our viewers are requested to leave their comments and questions. We will try to address some of them towards the end of the discussion. I won't delay further, so fasten your seatbelts. We welcome Professor Onustub Boshu amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you, Partho. I would like to thank Shomrat, Partho, Pavel especially, and other teachers and students at the Shammilani Mahavidyalaya for organizing this lecture series and inviting me here. I will be speaking on affect, neuroscience, and the humanities. But let me begin by taking up the category that sort of holds the themes together. Let me begin with the human. It is, of course, not just the biological species that we talk about when we talk about human rights, human dignity, or that thing called humanity or humanism. We have certain philosophical, political, theological, or juridical things in mind when we use the term, and when we use the term in a modern sense. The human, in that sense, is a conception. It's a perpetually shifting conception, and that too, a recent one. So what are some of these things? What makes the human? Now, there are, of course, a million answers to that that have been furnished across the ages and across the cultures. But for today, let's stick to the European tradition and identify some of them. Humans, in the first instance, have to be distinguished from animals. Humans are tool-making animals. They can stand erect, unlike other primates, and have prehensile thumbs that can grasp and manipulate objects. Humans, as Hegel would say, are for the most part rational, self-conscious beings that can postpone immediate gratification of instincts and appetites for future interests. In other words, humans can plan and rationalize, order, etc. Humans are political animals. They have been so for a long time, much before Aristotle famously pointed that out. In that sense, humans, unlike other animals, do not come to this world in a state of nakedness. There's a general consensus that all babies do, or at least should, be covered by social identities, juridical protections, citizenship, and human rights right from the moment they're born. A theologian citing Genesis 1.27 would say that humans were made by God in his own image. A caustic philosopher like Nietzsche would retort that modern humans had therefore killed God after making him in his own image. This list, of course, can go on, but let me bring this to a close by broaching a unique human trait. Hopefully, this will let us enter the main discussion. Humans come with a unique time consciousness. We are generally interested in not just who we are, but how exactly we came into being. Humans look upon themselves as becoming, evolving entities. We came from somewhere and should be going somewhere. One of the most influential models in this line of thinking is, of course, the Hegelian one. Here, individual human life becomes a sort of phylogenetic recap of the history of civilization itself. In other words, just as we mature from babies to full-grown adults, human history is itself seen as a progression from infancy to maturity. In Hegel, the infancy of human history was set in India. Youth was in Greece. The individual, let's say midlife, phase was in Rome, and the old age was reached in Hegel's own Prussia. So, in other words, now we know what exactly we mean when we say some place was the cradle of human civilization. The idea, of course, is that we began from a cradle and we are heading towards maturity and ripeness. But here we can start making the story a bit complicated. In the European Enlightenment, it was broadly acknowledged that human beings evolve, but some humans evolve faster and better than others. So this vision of history, as we know, was used to justify some of the worst crimes of human history: colonialism, genocide, slavery, complete subjugation and exploitation of women and the lesser races. Now, in relation to what has been said so far, we can immediately identify some of the common techniques of dehumanization that have preceded genocide and oppression. Comparing humans to monkeys is a very common example. We, of course, know about human zoos of the 19th and early 20th centuries, in which across Europe and America, entire African tribes were displayed. Actually, we don't have to go back that far. In the 1958 World Fair in Brussels, an entire Congolese village was displayed. Then again, as we know, Jews were called amoeba, bacteria, and termites in Hitler's Germany before being sent to gas chambers. The word termite, of course, has been politically used in India recently. It has been used in a chilling manner. Now, where am I going with this? The question of humanity and its myriad complications in the registers of gender, race, sexual orientation, or ethnicity can, of course, be framed in many ways. Today, I'm choosing to frame it as a mind and body problem. As we shall see in a minute, in European Enlightenment thinking, humanity at its finest involved the cultivation of a civilized mind and a social process to ensure that the mind always rules the body. That is, if we return to the metaphor I used a while back, individual or civilizational growth is a story of achieving a certain balance, a certain concord, an equation between the powers of the mind and the capacities of the body. As we grow up, we are expected to normalize and discipline ourselves. We are expected to learn things, follow rules, check our emotions, control our drives, and mitigate our hormonal urges. Normal adulthood, in that sense, means a state of rightness in which the mind has gained absolute command over the body. Now, if we amplify this metaphor, we also understand why lesser humans have always been infantilized. They are always compared to children, which is the other option to dehumanizing. I use the word infant, keeping its Greek etymology in mind. Infants, beings without language. The infant is she who has no say. In Athenian democracy, three entities had no say: the woman, the infant, and the slave. So in that light, we understand why it took such a long time for women to get the power to vote. Of course, even to this day, patriarchs regularly dismiss the idea of a woman CEO or a woman president, because while they might have impeccable qualifications, women are assumed to be too emotional to take tough decisions. African colonialism and slavery was justified because they were like children. That is, even as physically full-grown entities, the stereotypical African had bodies with unruly hormonal compositions, drives, appetites, and instincts. That was because they did not have the mental capacities to engage with modern disciplines and gain proper control over their actions and bodily proclivities. And then there were others who did not stick to a moral economy of temperance when it came to substances that would disturb the order between the mind and the body. The American Indian was thus the perennial drunk. The 19th century Chinese person was always addicted to opium. The colonial native in India was too otherworldly, engrossed in, traveling in spiritual la-la lands, to take off practical responsibilities of the adult, and so on and so forth. Lesser bodies, infantile bodies, were thus disaffected bodies. And here I briefly introduce the theme of affect. We'll come to that later. That is, these bodies produced unruly energies that could not be brought under the rule of a rational mind. Thus, historically speaking, when it came to global humanity, Europe was imagined as the mind, and the rest of the nations, the rest of the limbs of humanity. The questions of human/humanity and that of the mind and body have always given us anthropomorphic determinations of social order. And so far, we have stuck to Europe, and I will stick to the Western tradition for the most part today. But such imaginations are, of course, not unique to the West. We could, example, broach the metaphysical basis for the caste Varna system in India, outlined first in the famous Purusa Sukta of the Rig Veda, and then ratified later by other texts like the Manusmriti. This was an issuing forth of the four Varnas from the cosmic body or Purusa. The Brahmins from the mouth, the Kshatriya from the arms, the Vaishyas from the thighs, and the Shudras from the limbs. It was thus declared that this sort of ordering just give me a minute. It was thus declared that this sort of ordering will help disaffections in check and produce a harmonious social metabolism. So now I will get to the mind and body question, but before that, let me highlight 3 points of concern. One, first, I will approach this question from the perspective of the humanities as an overall anthropological project. That is, an entire system of knowledge humans set up to study humans and their activities. This was an Enlightenment credo, perhaps most famously declared by Alexander Pope in Epistle 2 of An Essay on Man. The proper study of mankind is man. So the humanities are supposed to constantly tell us about humans, how they form societies, how they write poetry, or how they run economies. So why exactly do we have traditionally scientific disciplines entering this domain? Why do we have neuroscience or the medical humanities? Now, interaction between the humanities and sciences is nothing new, of course. One can, for instance, recall how an entire generation of English poets reacted with dismay as well as elation to Newton's 1704 treatise on optics. Basically, the rainbow was not divine or magical anymore. And then we can think of Darwin, about Lord Kelvin's law of entropy, relativity, space travel, information revolution, etc., etc. But these incursions of science and technology into the domain of the humanities, more often than not, altered worldviews about the human and her cosmic and natural environment. The present interface between neurosciences and the humanities is different, because in this case, neuroscience does not presume to provide secondary knowledge about human condition. That is, tell us about our position in the universe or about the virus that ails us. Neuroscience seeks to do something much more fundamental. It aspires to compel humanists to alter their essential conception of the human in itself. Number two draws from number one. We know that the origins of many disciplines in the humanities were dubious. The discipline of English literature came into being in India and not Oxford or Cambridge, basically to brainwash a native elite to become brown sahibs. Early anthropology and ethnology was largely prompted by the colonial desire to identify the criminal tribes and decide British military strategy, and so forth. But the humanities also always spoke truth to power, not by just by proposing definitions of the human, but by attacking and destroying existent status quoist conceptions of the human. By constantly reinventing and displacing being and subjectivity. The time has come, in that vein, to seriously ask whether neuroscience compels contemporary humanists to do the same all over again. Is mind what we thought it was? Is the body what it used to be? Is the mind located in the brain? Is the mind synonymous with the brain? Or is the brain a part of the body, just as a part of the overall neurological process involving the central and the peripheral nervous systems? I will get to these questions eventually, but let me begin with a philosophical moment from the 17th century. It inaugurates a dispensation we may call Cartesian humanism in short. In part 6 of his Meditations on First Philosophy, René Descartes, as we know, attempted to solve the riddle of consciousness. Excuse me. Attempted to solve the riddle of consciousness. He did so by proposing a categorical dualism between the mind and the body. The mind, for Descartes, was an immaterial thing, while the body was substantive. The mind was res cogitans, a thinking entity which was its own essence. The body, on the other hand, including the brain, was res extensa, that which exists. This, of course, leads to the famous line in Descartes that we see in coffee mugs and t-shirts: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Basically, the body might be an illusion brought forth by some deceiving demon. It is consciousness that assures me of my existence. The riddle here, of course, is an old one found across many philosophical traditions. Think of the famous question posed by the Chinese philosopher Zhangzi in the 4th century before Christ. Zhangzi dreamt that he was a butterfly. When he woke and asked himself, I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming that I was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly now, dreaming that I am a man? The Cartesian answer to that would be that the body of the butterfly or that of the man, either of them, could be illusions. But what assures me of my existence is that I am conscious and thus can dream and also think about this question itself. But then in Descartes, there is what is called an interaction problem. If mind is immaterial and the body is material, how do they engage with each other? How does the mind prompt or push the body to do something? Descartes' answer to that, to be honest, was a rather dicey one. He proposed that the pineal gland in the brain was the site where material urges, neuronal signals, stimuli, whatever, passes onto pure mental stuff. So that's the station, the junction where that transfer happens. There have been, across the centuries, a million ways to deal with this problem. I won't get into that. Just to mention one, occasionalism of Nicholas Malebranche, for instance, suggested that it was God. It is God who intervenes at every step to mediate between the mind and the body. So I think of lifting this glass and God miraculously intervenes to allow me to do that. But I will not go there. What I'm extracting from Descartes' work are two propositions. One, there is a duality and a hierarchy between the mind and the body. Two, the mind is epiphenomenal. Epiphenomenal in the sense that it's beyond phenomenal existence. The mind is beyond our corporeal existence. Now, there is also another important category in Descartes that I will set aside. It is that of the soul. This is something he develops more fully in his other famous work, Passions of the Soul. It is the human who has the soul. The body of the dog, for instance, is no different from an automaton. Descartes didn't use the word robot because it wasn't available, but he could have. And that is because dogs do not have souls. So their entities are in a sense, no different from machines. People have searched for the soul and have tried to determine its exact location in the body. Many of Europe's earliest experiments with human anatomy were prompted by the quest for the soul. Excuse me. In 1901, a person called Douglas McDougall conducted the notorious experiment in which he concluded that the human soul weighs 21 grams. And there is a film starring Sean Penn, which is titled 21 Grams, keeping that in mind. Actually, this thing continues today as well. There are contemporary Christian efforts to integrate neuroscience and CAT scan or MRI imaging technologies, to integrate them to the quest for the soul. But I'm going to leave that aside, because in a sense, the question of the soul has not been secularized in the modern era, while the question of the mind has. The question of the mind, for the most part, has been a secular one, a practical one. The mind persistently features in our lives as a medical, juridical, or scientific category, not so much the soul. In other words, we don't go to the doctor to be informed about our soul. We can be deprived of voting rights, property rights, or sent to an institution if it is suspected that we have lost our minds. Not so much if people think we have lost our souls. So anyways, let me come back to the Cartesian mind and body problem. There is a duality and a hierarchy between the mind and the body. The mind has to command and regulate the somatic processes of the body. The intellectual history surrounding what I'm calling Cartesian humanism is an enormous one. I will therefore visit just one moment in Freud and psychoanalysis. I will do that for a reason more than anything else. The recent turn to neuroscience in the humanities has been prompted by a desire to move on from the Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis that dominated literary theory, cultural studies, or film and media studies in the 20th century. I do not wish to open a can of worms about psychoanalysis here. I will simply draw attention to a basic duality that persists in Freud. He struggles at every step to distinguish events of psychosis in the mind from the somatic processes in the body. Consider this sentence from The Interpretation of Dreams, and I quote, "The psychical mechanism employed by neurosis is not created by the impact of a pathological disturbance upon the mind, but is present already in the normative structure of the mental apparatus." The Cartesian question here is obvious. How can one make an ontological distinction between pathological processes and the mental apparatus? What is the mental apparatus made of? Is the psychosis of the mind substantively different from the biochemical processes of the body? Now we have a fair idea about how the brain works: gray matter, white matter, neuronal layers, sensory regions, motor regions, associational regions, etc., etc., etc. Where exactly and at what point can we separate pure mental processes from all of this? Is the mind just a metaphysical name for the brain in that case? If that is the case, then how can we separate the brain from the body and give it a special status? Isn't the brain a continuation of the central nervous system in the body that works in concert with peripheral nervous systems? Freud, of course, is a massive and dexterous thinker. He always, at every step, cautiously spells out that what he is constructing is an analogical or metaphorical description. It is always work in progress, to be revised with new biochemical or anatomical discoveries. A little later in his work, he describes the perceptual apparatus in the brain as a telescope with eyepieces, lenses, and the thing that holds everything together. Now, the Cartesian question here would be, where is the light as pure mental thing coming from, light that goes through the telescope? Is the mind a net effect, an abstraction of the biochemical neuronal processes in the brain and affects in the body? So with this backdrop, let me turn to neurosciences and its contemporary transformational effects on the humanities. There are some simple answers. Neuroscience today claims to have acquired the powers to read minds in terms of trackable data-driven processes. It can erase memories, perhaps one day can even implant them. It claims to be able to predict propensities towards violence. I think one of the best introductions to this field of engagement in recent times is the anthology of essays called The Neuroscientific Turn, edited by Janelle Johnson and Melissa Littlefield, who is my colleague here at the University of Illinois. In their introduction, Johnson and Littlefield point out a few things. Neuroscientists have questioned the traditional reckonings of the subject and object in the humanities and social sciences. And that is because functional neuroimaging, CAT scans, MRIs, etc., PET, can present anatomical correlates of various cognitive processes. That is, all the processes of the mind have physical correlates in brain function. You can have an exact picture of what happens to your brain while you're watching a funny film, for instance. Not just that, it is assumed that every subjective state has associated neuronal coordinates which can be artificially manipulated to induce an experience of that state. You know, that through molecular biology, data helmets, virtual reality, etc. Some humanities and social science scholars have thus moved to the lab, while others use secondary data from the neurosciences, and they also have cognitive theory as a theoretical backbone. What happens to your prefrontal cortex or hippocampus when you hear Mozart? How can we look at autobiographical writing in this new light? Where should we look for answers to our deepest questions about consciousness, learning, selfhood, and so forth? 3, there is also the question of neuroplasticity. Because neuroplasticity explodes the myth that the human brain becomes a fixed entity once we become adults. Now we know that brain structures can be changed by thinking. Nicholas Carr's 2010 book, The Shallows, draws on neuroplasticity research to argue that the internet is literally changing the brain of its users. Cultural life gets mixed into bodily brain processes. It's not just about how the brain perceives art, but about how art changes the human brain. So how do we reconceptualize the mind and body problem? How do we integrate psyche and soma? This is where I bring in the question of affect. Affect, as we know, is a conceptual shorthand we use to understand embodied experience. That is a form of experience that we no longer ascribe to the mind and the mind alone, but to the body and a reconfigured mind in relation to that body. We sometimes use common expressions like gut feeling. How do we take it more seriously? We use terms like muscle memory. Virat Kohli plays a cover drive from muscle memory. When the ball is coming at you at 150 km per hour, the response is affective, not a conscious one, not a planned execution. At least, that's what I think. Also, if Virat picks up a new shot, the helicopter shot, for example, I've never seen him play that, the hardwiring in his brain changes. That's the lesson of neuroplasticity. It does not remain the same because it has already forged new neuronal triggers and combinations that were not there before. What is displaced by theories of affect is the Cartesian separation and hierarchy between the mind and the body. Affect as such, in the powerful sense, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze draws from his work on Spinoza and Bergson, is the refutation of the general Cartesian rule that affection, affectio, is directly of the body, while affect, affectus, refers to the mind and the mind only. So in Deleuze's conception, the mind is not imperial. It is parallel to the body. For Deleuze, therefore, the idea of affect is to affirm the powers of the body beyond the knowledge we have of it, and the powers of the mind beyond the consciousness we have of it. The question of affect thus disturbs and problematizes the ways in which we have understood matters of identity, representation, ideological interpellation, consciousness, or subject formation in the course of the long 20th century. In the light of affect as embodied experience, let us go to the pending question. Is the brain a central organ that sort of houses the mind, understood in a metaphysical sense? So I'm just going to mention a few I'm going to end by mentioning a few interesting formulations that I have come across in this interface between neuroscience and the humanities pertaining to the mind and body thing. According to Antonio Damasio, for instance, and the book is called Descartes' Error, human reason operates through interactions between many neurological organizations rather than a single brain center. Intelligence involves mapping and integrating signals from an entire body landscape. A feeling is a mere snapshot of that. Nature would include all external stimuli, genetically engendered responses, and inherited social mores. The body is thus one organism of interactive biochemical and neural circuits, endocrine, immune, and automatic neural components, and physiological operations. What we call the mind is this structural and functional assemblage rather than the brain alone. Damasio's study is based on patients in whom brain lesions have impaired the experience of feelings. He talks about the phantom limb syndrome. Phantom limb syndrome, for those who are not familiar with it, is when you, let's say, a person has an amputated leg, a leg has been cut off, but can continue to feel sensations in that leg which is no longer there. Sensations like, a finger sort of scratching, or a toe is being irritated, or something like that, tickling. So phantom limb syndrome, and I hope I pronounce this well, and also anosognosia, in which patients do not realize that they are paralyzed and therefore not concerned about their future. In her admirable work, The Transmission of Affect, Teresa Brennan suggests that before the Cartesian biopolitical individual came to the fore, it was quite common to associate feelings with atmosphere. So that is the other thing in Freud, that for him the question of psyche is internalized into the theater of the mind, whereas this habit of associating sunlight or rain or some other thing to and that affecting our moods and our psychological dispositions is a long one. Like, if you think about the name lunacy, the term lunacy we use to indicate madness, it comes from the idea that the phases of the moon, the lunar sort of powers affect our sanity at times. So Brennan just defines entertainment, for example, as a neurological phenomenon in which several hormonal or nervous systems, chemical and electrical, are brought into alignment with hormones and pheromones acting as social catalysts. What further complicates matters is the body of evidence in recent research that questions the central assumption that it is the hypothalamus that triggers or arrests the release of hormones. In a general explanation of chemosensory processes, and she sort of gives particular attention to olfaction, smelling, Brennan points out that this scenario reveals a foundational crisis for Freudian psychoanalysis. Because Freudian psychoanalysis presumes an origin of affects that is autonomous of the neurological subject experiencing them. That is, in Freud, the question of affect and psychosis is locked up in an internal theater of the mind. The Freudian unconscious, according to Brennan, can be reconstituted as a theoretical fiction only as an immanent landscape that includes the voluntary, involuntary, sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous systems. The brain is an interpreter and not an originator of news and information. The unconscious, in other words, extends to the rest of the environment. It's not just in the mind, it's in the body, and also in everything that surrounds the body. In recent times, interdisciplinary collaborative projects like that between the neuroscientist M.R. Bennett and the philosopher P.M.S. Hacker and the have attacked in a much more frontal manner than Marcio or Brennan what is known as the endemic binding problem in neurosciences. That is, what is it that holds everything together? Now, Bennett and Hacker's is a two-pronged attack on dualism. Not only do they want to demolish the Cartesian mind, but also foreclose the possibility of inserting the brain as a substitute for the mind. Right? They point out, for instance, that during an epileptic seizure, due to abnormal excitations of the parts of the cortex, the person is temporarily denied some normal capacities like memory, decision-making, emotional stances, or sense of humor, but the abilities to perform routine actions are retained. Bennett and Hacker refuse all previous analogies pertaining to some sort of centrality of the brain here. The brain is neither the computer nor the master scanner or the programmer. It is not a central telephone exchange, and the mind is not the chief telephonist. Excuse me. The purposes of a person are neither the purposes of her brain nor those of her mind. Quote, they are purposes of the person. They are to be understood in terms of facts about human life, social forms of life, antecedent events, current circumstances, agential beliefs and values, and so forth. The metaphors, of course, in this domain get more and more interesting. Edelman and Tononi, they've written this book called The Universe of Consciousness. They are, for instance, Freudians who wish to extend the scope of the unconscious in the light of the neuroscientific turn. So I'm not going into that, but let's, for instance, cite one interesting picture from that study. So memory in their work is non-representational. It is like the melting and refreezing of a glacier rather than an inscription on a rock, and so on and so forth. So this interface between affect theory, neurosciences, and neurosciences changes humanities because it increasingly compels us to rethink the philosophical conception of the human, philosophical, political, social conception of the human, and the potentia of the human, what the human is capable of. So this reconceived body of embodied experience has entered into a new covenant with the soul that was thought to have imprisoned it, and with the mind that had apparently ruled it. This new body of neurosciences is as a matter of fact, threatens to extinguish the soul and extend itself to the brain, absolving the brain from the metaphysics of the mind. There is no escape from this body, no scope of that out of the body experience that that conscious humans have sought for ages, from range of techniques from transcendental meditation to virtual reality or drugs, etc. There is no out of body experience. It is because it is as impossible to leave the body, as it is easy to lose one's mind. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Thanks a lot for your excellent deliberation. I hope people have learned and they are eager to exchange their ideas. There have been some interesting questions which have come up, which I will read. But let myself begin with the questions. I have certain queries. I want to just start with them. You have, of course, partly answered those queries already, but then I want to clarify certain things. Like, one thing is the question of language. What is the role of language in the formation of the mind? And also, like I used the word, you have also talked about similar ideas. What is the relationship of the plasticity of the brain with its supposed anatomy? Like, the role of the language in the formation of the mind and its connection with the plasticity of the brain. That is one thing. I just ask 1, 2, 3 questions together, then we can take up some from the questions which have come from the audience. And is there also a problem with the privileging of the body as a concept? As it has been a problem privileging the mind when you try to justify the discourse of affect, emotion, as not located something to the mind, or as something specifically to the body, but the entire thing is manipulated and maneuvered by a certain neurological dispensation. So here you are privileging the body, but the body itself is located in the social. So these are some of the questions. Another thing is the question of literature. Do you think that the literary, I'm not talking about literature per se, but the moment of the literary, or if there is something called literary at all, it has a certain specific dimension to the production of the affect, and what would be its connection with the functioning of the brain? These are some of the questions. You can take these up and then we can proceed with the others. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the question of language, and it's a it's a very interesting question, but the point is exactly that if someone were to if you think about the great tradition of philosophical introspection on the question of language, and you can start from Plato and down to Heidegger or Derrida and beyond. It has always been whether we can think without language, or in other words, can there be a mind as an epiphenomenal entity that is prior to a linguistic ordering and meaningfulness that that language imparts to the universe, right? So if you, for instance, take the question of the Freudian unconscious, or rather in early Freud, the question, this thing called id, which is a primal entity that is placed prior to language. That is, language or linguistic constructs don't percolate there. So there has always been a tendency to find an essential mind, that one can trace back to God, or or logos in that sense, but that is prior to the babble of languages. There's the idea of the operations of the mind as a perfect communicability, an original prelapsarian communicability that existed before the babble of languages. So, that is what I can say for the moment. We can obviously carry on the conversation. About what was the second question, Shamrat? Could you just quickly remind me? Oh, what the privileging of the body. Yes, it is. There is something, obviously, which I couldn't cover in this talk. That is, I just laid out what exactly are the stakes in this. And I have my own set of skepticism, my own skepticism about and critical detachment with affect theory or neurosciences. And there are certain perils and entrapments that we can talk about. So yes, a reconceptualization of the body is there is a productive side to it, because it sort of lets us question the mind and its phenomenology and its claims to truth, etc., etc. But it can also bring us, a certain set of problems of its own. And it's like any other turn in the history of the humanities. Before the neuroscientific turn, there was obviously the linguistic turn of the late 70s, and that had its own consequences and reconfigurations. And the third question again, it's an excellent question about the literary, and and it is too profound a question to be able to answer, from the top of my head. But let me try suggesting something. To me, the value of the literary pertains to, terms that we are familiar with, to surprise, to defamiliarization, a kind of an expressive, novel way of seeing the world. So, insofar as that is concerned, it is an enactment of language. The literary is. It's an enactment of language that compels us to change our perceptual systems of our habits, our modes of habituation, of our social understandings. And what neuroscience would simply say is that it also changes our minds, our brains, rather. So, to go back to that theme I was talking about, it's not just about how the mind, the sovereign mind, looks at art or reads literature. It's about how the literary can literally change the brain, the configurations of the brain.
Yeah. Thank you for the answers, for the responses. So now I will ask a few questions from the audience who have asked certain questions. I read them out from the YouTube. And Pavel, can you please highlight? Pavel, you can highlight the questions as I read them on the screen. One by the last
Sure,
question, I
sure, of
begin
course.
with the end. That is easier.
Sure, of course.
But the question by Professor Ashok Mahapatra. He has asked that people like Wittgenstein ascribe to language games the potential for discursivity, poetics, and ethics. How about language then? Does it get relegated in the next scheme of brain-mind experience nexus? So that is one question. I can ask two or three, or you want to respond?
I should respond. Yes, it is a most pertinent question. But I think one of the ways to understand this is through the question of the sensuousness of language. Now, there are certain, when we think of the plastic arts, for instance, there are certain forms to which we usually, certain forms we connect to our sensuous being. That is, we have literally a physical feeling when we listen to the Ninth Symphony, or we have a certain, let's say, a haptic experience when we see Mona Lisa for the first time, or the Statue of David, or look at the Sistine Chapel. But I think what becomes central to this nexus of the brain-mind experience nexus is how language can be understood to have a profound sensuous dimension of its own, and that is the only way we can prevent its relegation. That the poetic use of language, for instance, it creates a bodily experience that is transformational. It is capable of literally changing the hardwire of the brain, or set up new kinds of neuronal exchanges that were not there before. Now, how far this is useful is a judgment I will reserve, because I don't personally do. That's not my area of expertise, and I don't work in that direction. Thank you, Professor Mohapatra, for that question.
Yeah. Then I ask another couple of questions. Another is Foucault Positively by Nikhat Parveen. Pavel, please highlight. Nikhat Parveen, the first question. Foucault positively discards the idea of Freud's theory of unconsciousness as inaccessible and states that human subjectivity builds through outward forces and power relation. And it connected to this, the second one, is a continuation of the same question, I think. So, in what way could you perceive the human subjectivity in the post-human turn?
Well,
so that is the question.
Well, yes. I just mentioned Deleuze. If you think about Deleuze, Guattari, and Lyotard's seminal 1974 book, forgetting the name, and of course Foucault's work, especially those pages on the repressive hypothesis at the beginning of the first volume of History of Sexuality. That is the question. Does the unconscious exist? Is there any or is the question of subjectivity to be radically reformulated? And there was, of course, an entire generation of French thinking in that direction. And I have nothing to say essentially about that, apart from the fact that I am not a Freudian, and I completely agree with at least some of what comes out of that particular French tradition of interrogating Freud. So insofar as human subjectivity is concerned, Foucault, of course, following I think Bachelard or Blanchard would suggest that subjectivities are discursive effects, right? From kind of a murmur of discourse that is always around us, and it is language and a linguistic environment, the categories, the concepts that are available to us that constitute subjects. And, in other words, the integrated subject at the ground level does not exist. It's a social phenomenon.
Yeah. Maybe one last question, two questions actually, asked by the same person, Vipasha Bhattacharya. If I may ask, keeping in mind reference points such as the Taoist strain of Zhuang, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correct, Zhuang, as well as Cartesian conceptions of duality, could you see Nick Bostrom's refreshingly logical argument on Libby? And another question, in a simulation state, as a relatively non-Eurocentric prism devoid of the urban myth quality, and thereby a usable model with which to look at the body between the body and mind. So that is the question. I'm not sure.
Legal stimulation state. This question is actually very easy to answer. I haven't read Nick Bostrom work, so I will not answer that. But insofar as the last part is concerned, I can consider it as a as a statement from Bipasha Bhattacharya herself. In a simulation state as a relatively non-Eurocentric prism devoid of the urban myth quality, and thereby a usable model with which to look at the volley between the body and mind. That's just that's thought. As I said, I haven't read Nick Bostrom's book, but that thought sort of reminds me about a current cultural phenomenon that has been on for like 2 or 3 decades of a certain human redundancy in an environment of simulation, postmodern sort of virtual environments, simulated environments, etc. And the thought reminds me of, for instance, the first of the films in the Matrix trilogy, and how that kind of a fear about artificial intelligence, about being entrapped in a kind of a constructed reality and not being able to get out of that bubble, at in various levels, losing the ability to form real life social relationships, not being able to converse with people except through the phone, and things like that. So that those are the things that current concerns about technology and the human condition that remind me of when I look at this question. As to the question itself, like I said, I can't respond because I haven't read the book.
Thank you, Professor Basu. I think we will end this session with these comment and this answer. Thanks a lot. It was really enlightening and stimulating, and the questions were very good. I thank the people who have asked these questions. And now, Pavel, can you please include Professor Parui? Yeah. So I welcome Professor Abhishek Parui to today's session. Yeah, Abhishek is a good old friend and a colleague. So he is here now. I'm very happy to host him to this online lecture series. And I think after Professor Basu's lecture, Abhishek's deliberation would become more relevant and more enlightening, because he will also be speaking on medical humanities, and he has also extensively worked on human consciousness. Professor Basu was also saying something along those lines. So I will straight go into the session, but before that, I will request our esteemed colleague, Megbaron Haiti, who is here, our departmental colleague, to just introduce Professor Parui and welcome him, so then he can continue with his talk. Thank you.
Samradha, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I think Professor Boshu is trying to say something. I think Professor Boshu is trying to say something.
Yes,
Yeah,
Mr.
please,
Basu.
Professor Basu.
Yes, I was just saying that I apologize to all of you and especially Abhishek. Good to see you. I have to leave and listen to the lecture, later, the recording. I have to leave because I have a meeting elsewhere. All right. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank
okay,
you,
sir.
Professor
Okay.
Basu.
Okay, sir.
I especially thank you to making your deliberation, and we will definitely continue with this conversation later. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Samradha for arranging such a nice discussion, and I would like to thank Mr. Basu for his astounding lecture. Now, today's second session in Humanities Beyond Discipline, lecture series 2. Today's session, we will begin shortly. We have with us Professor Abhishek Parui. He has done his PhD from Durham, is assistant professor in English at IIT Madras and associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. His research interests include memory studies, medical humanities, and critical theory, which he will be talking today. He will be delivering his lecture. He is also the author of postmodern literatures published from Orient Black Swan in 2018, and is currently writing in his second book entitled Culture and Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory, which will be published by Roman and Littlefield. I would like to welcome Professor Abhishek Parui. Our interesting topic. I won't take much time. Professor Parui.
Yes.
I would like to request you. Yes, you can start your.
Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, Abhishek. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you everyone, especially Shamratha, for the very kind invitation. It's an honor for me to be part of a series which includes really such stellar speakers, Professor Basu included. So I realize I'm filling in some very, very big shoes. So I'm actually a bit apprehensive about in terms of the quality, in terms of the pitch that I have, whether I'll be able to match up to my previous speakers in terms of academic quality. I'll do my best, but I'm sure it's not going to be enough. So at the very outset, I'll give a very generic description of my talk in terms of what I intend to do in this session. And then I'll move on to some specific texts that we can sort of map this theory on in terms of looking at the interface of memory studies and medical humanities, which is the topic that I aim to examine today. Now, first things first, let's discuss the ontology of these two disciplines. I mean, in terms of how that this can connect interdisciplinary ways, memory studies and medical humanities. Now, one obvious connection that we can think of in terms of looking at literature is obviously through trauma fiction, the whole idea of memory loss, traumatic disorders, and the medical extensions of those conditions, and how all that gets represented in fiction, in literature, because at the end of the day, I'm a literature person. I belong in the domain of English literature, literary studies. That is what whatever expertise I have is in that particular domain. So I don't claim to be a neuroscientist. I don't claim to be trained in clinical medicine. So all I do is I look at literary texts in terms of what they can offer, in terms of more nuanced understanding of memory and memory loss and the medical conditions that can extend, that can sort of emerge out of those conditions. Now, some of the things I need to unpack before I sort of move on. Let's talk about memory studies a little bit, and then I'll move on to how that can connect potentially to medical humanities, which is obviously the discussion for today. Now, the funny thing about memory studies is it's not really funny in a sort of dark, humorous sort of a way, that we in memory studies, we're actually more interested in the phenomenon of forgetting. rather than remembering. And so forgetting is a phenomenon that we are very interested in, psychologically, culturally, historically. And we don't look at forgetting as an innocent activity. We look at forgetting as a profoundly non-innocent, as a profoundly political activity, right? So forgetting in terms of what happens privately, in terms of how the brain forgets, and also forgetting as a cultural practice, forgetting as a cultural ritual, forgetting as an epistemic strategy, shall we say. So how does forgetting happen through textbooks, through different discourse networks that we constantly consume around us as we grow up? So just as a very short anecdote, so in terms of how certain kind of incidents, certain kinds of phenomena are forgotten and not sort of talked about and not part of the mainstream discourse, and hence they sort of cease to exist after a point of time. A very short anecdote that I can share at the beginning, and I usually share this at the beginning of every talk on memory studies. So this was when I was doing my PhD in Durham. I had a very good friend, and we were watching a film together. He wanted to watch a Bollywood film. So I recommended a film called Rang De Basanti, which I'm hoping everyone's seen. It's a really good film, technically speaking. So we started watching that film, and we enjoyed it till the point that we had the very grotesque scene of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Amritsar massacre. At which point, this very liberal friend of mine, very liberal, white liberal British person, otherwise very well read, very open, very critical of imperialism. He sort of gets very uneasy looking at a particular scene. So we sort of pause at some point, and then he asks me point blank that, well, I'm aware that imperialism is a terrible thing. I'm aware of the evil things from imperialism, but this particular incident did really take place, Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So it was my turn to be surprised, obviously, because here was a very well-read, well-traveled, liberal white person asking me about an incident that we all know. So I obviously said, well, I'm surprised I'm not aware of it. This is sort of 1918, and this is when a massacre takes place, 1990. Sorry. So, and this whole idea of, opening fire on an innocent crowd, killing innocent protesters, women, children, indiscriminately. So how is it that someone as well-read as you are not aware of this? To which his response was, well, obviously, we don't read it in our history books. We don't read it in our textbooks. And that was sort of a moment of epiphany for me, shall we say, when we realized that, the way we consume knowledge, the way we consume history, there's such a strong textual quality about it. What we remember, and more importantly, what we dismember. And this is where it gets sort of the medical meets the memory thing. What we dismember, what we cut off in terms of the remembering narratives is very, very important and very, very politically invested. So there's a lot of political investment, a lot of ideological investment, a lot of discursive investment in terms of what gets forgotten, right? And obviously we can think of any number of literary writers where this gets manifested over and over again. So the primary hypothesis, the beginning point of memory studies is the irony that we are more interested in forgetting what does not get remembered, what gets forgotten, what gets pushed into oblivion, or rather the production of oblivion, the production of amnesia. So we look at amnesia, oblivion, forgetting as sort of productive activities, as agentic activities sometimes, and obviously as discursive activities which have a lot of discourse investments into them. Right, and obviously we know from neuroscientists today, I'm going to mention a few neuroscientists subsequently as we move on in the session, that the whole process of remembering is a very biased process. We know it, that a brain is a very biased machine. We know it through empirical research. We know it through medical research. There are lots of papers written on it, and I'm going to mention a few as we move on. But the general knowledge that we have today about the brain is that it's a profoundly biased machine. It's a neural network, and it's very, very biased in terms of what it remembers and what it chooses to remember and what it chooses to not remember. So again, the absence becomes very, very important. And obviously, as we all know in literature, that we are more interested in literature with the sort of the articulation of absence, shall we say. What are these slippages, the ellipses, the things which are between the lines? Because the whole business of literature and literary writing and literary production is to sort of pack things between the lines. And that is obviously a very big deal, shall we say, in literature. And that is what makes it ontologically different or effectively different from, let's say, a journalistic writing, a piece of journalism, a piece of newspaper report. The fact that it can move us effectively, not just effectively, but also effectively. And we were listening to Professor Basu talking about effect. Such a brilliant session. But that's the whole business of literature in terms of sort of producing this effect, or this effective instrument through language. And obviously, when you're looking at effective instruments, effective representations, silences become very, very important. You know, what does not get said, what does not appear becomes more important in literary writing. And that's where memory loss, forgetting, forgetfulness, they sort of converge very interestingly in terms of literary writing. That is the reason why we in literary studies are interested in these aspects as well. And also equally, that's the reason why so many neuroscientists today are looking at literature, looking at literary representations in terms of having a more complex understanding of the mind. The mind is different from the brain. So the brain is mappable. There's a degree of unmappability about the mind. There's a degree of mutability about the mind. And this unmappability and mutability is obviously the business of literature, the literary writing, the production of unmappability, shall we say. So the whole idea of memory being a very biased activity, memory as an entangled activity becomes important for us today. And we need to arrive, again, so when I mentioned at the beginning that we are more interested in the phenomenon of forgetting, what I should also say at this point is that we are looking at memory and we are looking at forgetting not as an ontological opposite of remembering, but rather forgetting as a cognitive component of remembering, as some kind of an entangled thing. So forgetting and remembering are not really binary opposites of each other. And again, this is something which we get from neuroscience today, that forgetting is not really the ontological opposite of remembering, but it's actually a cognitive component of remembering. So in other words, if you are to remember, you must be able to forget. So again, we're looking at forgetting as an ability, as an agentic ability, something that we do, sometimes deliberately, sometimes non-deliberately, but something that our brain must do. And again, what we are interested in memory studies is looking at the interface between the private brain and the macro-cultural space. Because, you know, if you take a look, if you look at the structural and functional similarities between how the brain remembers and forgets simultaneously, we also see a similar activity happening in the broader, more macro realm of culture, where things are codified and decodified. So things are forgotten and remembered in every culture. So every nation, every national history, and we look at Britain, I've mentioned example of British imperialism, but we can think of any national history where certain events are deliberately forgotten. In other words, certain events are deliberately not remembered, not commemorated, right? So this non-commemoration of certain events as against the constant commemoration, the continuous commemoration of certain other events, obviously is a discursive difference. And so again, we're looking at the very interesting interface, shall we say, between the brain and culture. And this is where memory studies becomes interesting, because memory studies on one hand, so it is obviously very psychological in quality. We're looking at neuroscience, we're looking at psychology, cognitive psychology, clinical psychology, but also we can see how it sort of extends into cultural studies in the sense of how every culture is a sort of a process of remembering and forgetting simultaneously. Right? So the second inference, second point that I'm going to highlight a little bit in this lecture is looking at forgetting and remembering as connected activities, as entangled activities. Right? So with these hypotheses, with these inferences, and with these arguments, let me dive into the session in terms of looking at the way in which we can look at the connection between memory studies and medical humanities. Right? So what is medical humanities? So as the very title suggests, it's a very interdisciplinary kind of network of knowledge. And this is the beauty as well as the complexity of memory studies and medical humanities, in the sense that it's very organically interdisciplinary. It doesn't have to be interdisciplinary. It doesn't have to look out for interdisciplinary perspectives. It's very organically and ontologically interdisciplinary in quality. So as I just mentioned, there is that embedded hardcore cognitive quality about remembering and forgetting, but equally there is an extended cultural quality about remembering and forgetting. So we are immediately looking at the interface of cultural studies, psychology, clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, affect studies, material engagement theory, memory studies, and so on and so forth. So we can see there's a series of knowledge networks that we have at our disposal, which makes it such a complex field, which makes it a challenge as well as part of its rewarding quotient is due to this complexity, this complex entanglement of different disciplines, shall we say. So in terms of looking at what we can do with these two disciplines together, the two kinds of knowledge networks that we can have, the sort of convergences as well as departures between memory studies and medical humanities. So where do we situate humanities? More specifically, where do we situate literature or literary studies into these two disciplines? So my effort in this particular session is to look at the research possibilities that might emerge from this convergence. And this is something that we are doing in IIT Madras. So we have this sort of research network of memory studies that we had this annual conference last year as well. And we're hoping to sort of make this into a broader field in due course of time. So what are we really doing? Who are we working with? What are the possibilities of this kind of research? Because one obvious thing that we can do with memory studies is to look at the relationship between the human brain and machines. And we have already worked with some scientists and people who work with augmented reality, virtual reality, in terms of how a machine remembers, if there are any subliminal biases in the way that information is fed into the machine and how the machine processes those information, etc. So there is that obvious trajectory that memory studies can take. And obviously there's a very clinical component as well, where we can potentially collaborate with doctors, and this is why medical humanities has taken off in a very major way, especially in British universities, Durham, and also Leeds and certain other places as well, where we have sort of medical humanities centers where we have people from different disciplines, poets, literary scholars, writers, as well as obviously doctors and philosophers and psychologists who are sort of coming together and talking about memory loss, amnesia, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, etc., and looking at a way in which different perspectives can really combine together in terms of offering a more nuanced understanding of the human mind. And of course, as we all know, and we have listened to Professor Basu previously, the mind is a very complex category. So whereas the brain is sort of neural and medical and mappable by machines, etc., there's always this endlessly extended quality about the mind. So it is brain as well as something more than a brain. So there is a social discursive quality about the mind as well, which makes it unmappable to a certain extent, because there's this inside-outside loop happening all the time. So whereas there is this very embedded neural quality, the way we process information, the way we accept information, the way we consume information, is obviously very neural in quality, and there are some very interesting books written on it. There's a very funny book that I recommend. It's called "Did My Neurons Make Me Do It?" It's supremely funny. It's dark humorous. It's looking at the relationship between free will, agency, and neurons. So it's making the argument that is it possible to make the argument that everything is neural? So if I murder someone, is it really my fault, or did my neurons make me do it? So it is obviously very deliberately reductionist in a very slapstick kind of a way. So that's just one kind of book that we can read. But we all know that it is not quite the case, that the mind is not neural. It's not just neural. There is obviously the cultural, discursive, phenomenological quality about the mind, which makes it simultaneously embedded and extended. And we are interested, I personally find Andy Clark's notion of cognition very, very interesting. And Andy Clark is a theorist that we use quite extensively, where he has the 4E models of cognition that I'm sure is familiar to most of us here attending the session. And the 4E models are the embedded, the embodied, the enactive, and the extended. So the 4E models of cognition by Andy Clark. And he's looking at the mind as a constant process of all these different kinds of cognition. The embedded kind of cognition is neural in quality, but equally the enactive, the extended, and the embodied. Right? So all these different E's come together in terms of understanding of how the mind operates. And it obviously gives a very interesting sort of unmappability about the mind, which makes it such a complex instrument that we can look at from a cultural studies perspective, from a medical studies perspective, and obviously from a psychological, neuroscientific perspective as well. Now, in terms of looking at literature, so why literature at all? Now that we have some kind of understanding between memory studies and medical humanities, where does literature come in? Is it a bit of an outsider? Is it making a sort of trespass entry? Or is it a natural and very welcome guest into this discourse network of mind, brain, medical humanities, memory studies, etc.? So let's look into that in a moment. Now, we need to have certain ontological definitions of literature. And I find some of the working definitions that I use And this book that I'm writing now at the moment is very kindly mentioned in the introduction, Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory. I'm looking at the relationship between matter and metaphor. So how does matter become metaphor? What is a sort of complex process through which matter is coded into something metaphorical, and then how that get extended into memory, so matter, metaphor, memory, which is the subtitle of the book that I'm writing. So the whole relationship between the material and the metaphorical, and how that enters the memory network, which is consumed as a cultural activity, as a private activity, etc. But for us to sort of understand that, let us look at, let us sort of try at least to have some working definitions of literature. So what is literature? And more importantly, what is fiction? So why look at fiction at all in terms of understanding how the medical condition of the mind, how the memory condition of the mind works? Because we have neuroscience for that, we have psychology for that, we have different kinds of scientific medical instruments for that. So why look at fiction at all? So what is it about fiction that makes it some of a unique form of representation of the mind in terms of the medically determined mind, as well as the remembering mind? So what is it about fiction and remembering? Now, my working definition of fiction, and obviously this is a very loose and generic definition that I've sort of devised for my own comfort, shall we say, but my working definition of fiction is a production of possibilities. Right? So fiction is a production of possibilities. In other words, it gives us a very complex combination of what really happened or happens, and it combines that with what could have happened or what can possibly happen. And it's a very constant combination of all these different perspectives, what really takes place and what really took place, historically speaking, with what could have taken place and with what can take place. So there was this very interesting temporal quality about fiction. It's looking back as well as looking forward. Because when I'm saying that it is a very complex combination of what really happened with what could have happened and what might happen, so what I'm actually saying is there's this very sort of chronotope-like quality about fiction, whereas looking back as well as forward simultaneously. So there is this, shall we say, temporal elasticity about fiction, which makes it such an accommodative medium. And I'm looking at fiction, I'm interested in looking at fiction as a medium, just like we look at film as a medium. I think it's important for us to sort of define fiction as a medium as well, in terms of how that offers very nuanced understanding of the brain, the mind, the cultural mind, medical mind, etc., the neural mind, etc. So where does fiction fit in? So if I were to go ahead with this definition of fiction as a production of possibilities, possibilities which emerge from what really happens, and how that sort of is complicated by the possibilities which might have happened, and also the possibilities which could have happened. So things which did not take place, along with things which did take place. So we combine all that together and complicate it further by saying, things which may take place later. So that's where the whole idea of science fiction comes in, things which are there as well as possibly there. So there is this very permanent proleptic quality about fiction, so anticipatory quality about fiction. It's looking back, it's looking forward, and obviously that makes it such a fluid medium of representation. And I'm interested in the sort of the ontology of fluidity, shall we say, right? The fluidity of fiction, and in terms of how that connects very interestingly with the fluidity of the remembering mind. Right? And I did talk a little bit about how the mind remembers, and how remembering and unremembering are almost simultaneous activities. They're not ontological opposites of each other, but these are actually cognitive components of each other. And we have some very interesting papers, and I'm happy to engage with that in lengthier discussion later. If I'm happy to engage in that with the emails. There are actually people writing very interesting papers from neuroscience in the position of psychology, cognitive as well as clinical psychology, where they're talking about how forgetting as an ability is a very crucial cognitive ability for the mind, for the brain, to keep functioning, right? Because forgetting must happen, and in some sense, we must be able to destroy information in the brain. If you don't destroy information, it's like destroying cells. For an organism to evolve, it must be able to destroy cells, right? So destruction is obviously an ability to a certain extent. And I was speaking a couple of days before, and I was drawing on Catherine Malabou's notion of plasticity. And it's a very fantastic concept because it's conceptually very complex, that notion of plasticity of Malabou. Because she's obviously talking about plasticity from a neural perspective, from a cellular perspective, from a biological metabolic perspective, but also plasticity from a cultural perspective, from a linguistic perspective, from a post-structuralist perspective. And the reason why I find Malibu, or Catherine Malibu, and her work so fascinating for someone like me is because she offers a very critical theory understanding of the mind, a very post-structuralist understanding of the mind. I mean, Shamrata, I'm sure, has read Malibu, and we have discussions on Malibu and Derrida. It's like a very Derridan take on how the mind functions, of how trauma happens. So in that sense, it's very post-Freudian, it's very post-classical, right? It's more distributive, it's more fluid, it's more post-structuralist, and that makes Malibu a very fascinating figure for this kind of research. So, you know, the books that she's written, The Ontology of the Accident, for example, Plasticity at Dusk. So these are books which talk about plasticity as a very sort of conceptually rich phenomenon, and something which can be studied from different perspectives, obviously cognitive, medical, cellular, but also equally sort of cultural, linguistic, literary as well. So Malibu is one person that I'm very, very interested in. Now, just in terms of looking at some other figures in this kind of work, one neuroscientist, I mean, there are several neuroscientists that we can talk about, but someone who comes immediately in mind is a person called Joseph Ledoux, Ledoux. The Ledoux has a series of interesting books, and he is very, very famous as a neuroscientist for his work on the synapse, or the synaptic quality of information. So synapse, as all of us know, is the bit between the neurons. So when one neuron ends, another neuron begins, that electrochemical transmission between neurons takes place in that area, the synapse. And now, interestingly, what Ledoux tells us today, from a very hardcore neuroscientific perspective, is that we are our synapses. So information coding, information encoding takes place apparently in the synapses. And now that obviously raises our critical theory antenna in our brain, because isn't the synapse quite literally and quite territorially the in-between space? Isn't the synapse quite literally and quite territorially the liminal space, right? Where one information ends and the other information begins. So we begin to sniff the structural similarities from literary studies perspective. That, you know, isn't this some kind of a connection that one can potentially make? And Ledoux actually offers very, very fascinating connections. I mean, he actually goes on to say, and I do recommend the book very, very heavily, The Synaptic Self, in terms of how that, you know, every information must be lost in the process. Certain parts of every information must be destroyed in the process. So again, we're looking at plasticity as a constant combination of destruction and construction. Right? So any act of transmission must contain destruction to a certain extent. And again, we can go back to literature, to classic literature, and there have actually been, we all know about Proust and memory and all of that. There have been some very recent papers written on Proust and the hypothesis of Proust, this sort of smell memory hypothesis, as we all know. But another slightly less known short story is a short story by Borges, and the very famous story is Funes the Memorious, or Funes the Rememberer, as it gets translated in different ways. So that story, again, is a sort of dark, humorous kind of story, slightly Kafkaesque in quality, actually. So if you read that story, it's about a boy we call Funes, who falls from a horse and has a head injury. And the disease he has is that he loses the ability to forget. And that's obviously very, very interesting. Because what Borges is telling us quite clearly is that forgetting is an ability, and the boy loses the ability, and that is a disease. That becomes a pathological condition. Now, what happens interestingly in the story is that his ability for abstractions begin to go away. His ability for empathy begins to go away. He cannot forget. He cannot destroy an information. So destruction as an ability, destruction as an agentic ability, that's something an individual must be able to do. That is taken away from him through this injury, through this head injury. And there have been some very fascinating works specifically on that paper, on that story, where it talks about how the question of plasticity and destructive plasticity is a core cognitive component. And this is what the very beginning of my talk I mentioned, that we need to look at forgetting not as an ontological opposite of remembering, but forgetting as a cognitive component of remembering, both at a micro level, in the sense of how the brain remembers, and also in terms of the macro level, in terms of how our culture remembers. Every act of remembering is also simultaneously an act of dismembering, as we all know. right? So Ladue is one figure that I'm fascinated by, and some more famous neuroscientists who are sort of looking at literature quite constantly, and also philosophy quite constantly, is obviously Antonio Damasio. I'm sure Shonda has read Damasio. We had discussions on Damasio with him, and I'm sure he's a very familiar figure who's written on Spinoza, who's written on Descartes, who's written on, he's looking at literature quite seriously in terms of how the affective, fluid medium of fiction can actually offer a very nuanced understanding of the human mind, which he thinks is a more complex category than the brain. And this, mind you, is coming from a neuroscientist, a very globally acclaimed neuroscientist who has phenomenal works on sort of somatomarkers of cognition, phenomenal works on the relationship between emotion and cognition. And again, this is where Damasio gets very, very interesting, because he is a very, very strong sort of propounder, a very strong sort of advocate of the relationship between emotion and cognition. Some of his best works in neuroscience is about that relationship. And that, in a way, undercuts the very Cartesian claim of rationality and cognition. As we all know, the whole idea of the rational man being the cognitively potent man. So cognitive competence relies on rationality. If you go back to Descartes and sort of dig him up and sort of look at the way in which cognition appears in the Cartesian understanding, cognition as a product of rationality, which is obviously trying to make itself ontologically different from emotionality. Now, when it comes to someone like Damasio, he says that actually emotions form a very core component of cognition. So if our ability to be emotional goes away, so in other words, if our affective ability goes away, that will also sort of impact our effective ability. So again, we're looking at a very close relationship between affect and effect, right? So obviously literature as an affective medium, literature as a fluid medium, literature as a medium which can defamiliarize language becomes very important for someone like Damasio. And that obviously sort of really connects very well in his discourse of memory studies and medical humanities. So Damasio is someone that we all know. He's written on Spinoza, he's written on Descartes, and he's written on a series of things that are interesting for us. The other neuroscientists that are interesting for us is obviously Eric Kandel. Kandel has got books on, he's written on Nabokov, Joyce, Woolf, in terms of, again, the idea of the epiphany, the idea of the sort of cognitive understanding of the epiphany, and how the affective description of epiphany, the affective extended quality of epiphany, is something which is very, very complex from a cognitive perspective. So what happens when a mind experiences epiphany? And those first interested in modernist literature will know epiphany is a very serious business of literature. Modernism is a lot of epiphanies, about the thinking mind suddenly having a revelation, and how the revelation is, especially when it comes to someone like Joyce, we find out how he complicates the biblical quality of the epiphany and makes it sort of secular, almost sexual and erotic in quality. So we have this very interesting erotic epiphany in Joyce, which is obviously quite discursive, because we have this very repressed Catholic subjects and a very repressed Dublin, claustrophobic Dublin, experiencing the sexual phenomenon of epiphany. So again, what happens when the epiphany takes place? So how do you describe it? And we have someone like Kandel, Eric Kandel, who's actually looking at Nabokov and Joyce and Woolf, and of course Krauss. Krauss is the poster boy for memory studies, as we all know, in terms of a more complex understanding of cognition, right? So, and I'm just going to begin to wind up now, but I'm just going to connect someone like Ladue to another theory that I find quite interesting, and that theory is a theory of cognitive narratology, right? And one of the biggest figures in that theory is David Herman. Someone I was very lucky to know personally in Durham. Herman's work on storytelling and cognitive sciences is something which is fascinating, because he looks at the activity of storytelling, again, as a neural activity, how we process information and how we reprocess and represent information in a narrative. That is the micro-private quality of storytelling, but also storytelling as a cultural activity. So how do we preserve information through storytelling? So the whole business of oral narratives, for example, the whole storytelling quality, how it becomes some kind of an archive, a collectively shared archive, shall we say, of incidents, events, things which happened, but again, equally things which did not happen, things which could have happened, but were not allowed to happen. So storytelling, obviously, as we all know, can be a very profoundly politically subversive activity. So storytellers can be subversive, and we have endless examples in fiction, and also cinema and philosophy, starting from Plato, who banishes the poet from the Republic. So storytelling can become, because then again, you go back to the earlier definition of fiction that I have, fiction as a combination of what really is taking place with what could take place, and sometimes with what should take place. So there is this utopian quality about fiction as well. It can also tell us about what really should be happening, and obviously that tells us what is not really happening. So again, we have the production of absence in fiction. So it can tell us things which are happening and also things which are not happening. So not happening becomes a very important business in fiction, just like unremembering to a certain extent. And again, we are looking at unremembering very seriously as a political activity, as a discursive activity, and obviously as a cognitive activity in some sense. But just to wind up with Herman and how that connects to someone like Joseph Ladieu, Herman, in his phenomenal book, which I recommend very, very heavily, Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, he has a very interesting idea of chunking. So what is chunking, essentially? And chunking is something which neuroscientists are very, very increasingly interested in. So in other words, chunking is a certain bit of information which gets processed. So again, we go back to Ladieu, who is saying that every act of transmission, neural act of transmission, is also a loss of transmission. In other words, what Herman is saying and what Ladieu is also saying, and interestingly, Ladieu also uses the word chunking. I'm sure they don't know each other. These didn't know each other when they're writing the two separate books. But it's an interesting thing that even a neuroscientist and a storytelling, someone who's working on cognitive methodology, are talking about the same concept using the same word, the idea of chunking. In other words, what the brain remembers is always in chunks. And the moment I use the word chunk, I'm talking about the politics of inclusion. Certain things are included in a particular chunk, but also equally the politics of exclusion. So again, the certain things are excluded from a certain chunk, right? So a chunk can become a metaphor of this entanglement of absence and presence, the entanglement of inclusion and exclusion. And Herman, in that book, Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, he's talking about how the whole idea of narratology, how we tell stories, is a decision of chunking. So what gets chunked and what gets de-chunked? And again, we are back to the same fundamental principle that de-chunking is not an innocent activity. De-chunking is a very politically motivated activity, and even at a very neural embedded level, de-chunking is a very biased activity. Every brain is biased. The brain is a very bloody biased machine. And again, culture is equally biased, right? So the whole politics of bias, the whole ontology of bias becomes very, very complex if you look at these two convergence of medical humanities, memory studies, literature, culture, philosophy, psychology, etc. So I'm just going to wind up here with the idea of chunking, and I'm just going to go back and finish with Derrida, because I know Shamrada is a fanboy, and I owe it to him, and I'm sort of a fanboy as well on Derrida. So let's end with Derrida. And Derrida has written extensively on the idea of absence in literature, in his very famous book, Acts of Literature, for example. But equally, and this is why he's beginning to become big in memory studies, he also writes about traces, and Shamrada knows much more about this than I do. I'm sure he can discuss it later in the Q&A session. The quality, the idea of the trace in Derrida, something which gets erased, but not quite, right? It's sort of there as some kind of a ontological presence. And obviously, ontology is a profoundly political category. Spectrality is a profoundly political category. And Shamrada has spoken on spectrality in a fascinating session. But again, we're looking at absence as a political presence, absence as a political production, absence as a biased production, and also remembering, unremembering, absence, all become very, very biased and entangled together. And that is why, that is where I think fiction can emerge as a very potent and fluid medium of representation and understanding. And that is why people like us, at the end of the day, we are literary persons, we are literary theorists, we are critical theorists, people like us, we must, so there's a danger, I should also warn a little bit, there's a danger of seduction as well. We can be a bit too seduced by neuroscience and philosophy and psychology and move a little bit too much towards the empirical mode. But we need to ground ourselves very interestingly and very sort of robustly in literature, I think, because I think the attention is coming from outside as well. Neuroscientists are looking at literature. People like Damasio and Ladieu and Kendall, they're actually talking about literature and literary discourses and literary representations. So I think we need to focus on fiction as a medium, fiction as an ambivalent medium, and I use the word ambivalence quite sort of etymologically as well as ontologically. Ambivalence, not as confusion, but ambivalence is ambivalent. So plural possibilities. Ambivalence has the ability to accommodate and articulate differences. Ambivalence has the ability to articulate two valences which are mutually contradictory with each other. So literature has the ability to articulate remembering as well as unremembering. So all you have to do is read someone like Kundera, for example, the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, where forgetting becomes such an important activity for the individual as well as for a particular culture in a post-communist Czechoslovakia, for example, where the spectrality of communism is so much there in a very Derridian sense, but doesn't get talked about. And paradoxically, this not being talked about actually makes it representational in a certain sense. So I'm just going to end here at this point, and I'm happy to take questions here at this particular session, but also I'm happy to engage in lengthier discussions over emails, so feel free to write to me subsequently as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Abhishek. It was a very, very energetic session, and I'm happy that it perfectly complements Professor Basu's lead, which he gave before you. It was perfectly complementing, because I asked a question of the literary, which Basu definitely answered in his own way, but your deliberation basically prolonged that idea of the literary. So the certain queries, certain elaborations which were required also comes in your talk. So I will begin with my own questions. Let the questions come. In the meanwhile, some questions are coming, so let them come. But then I can ask you some questions, and some certain conversations we can have among ourselves. So one is, again, going back to Derrida. I noted down this question before you referred Derrida. So it's a question. Derrida has a very interesting essay called "How to Avoid Speaking About Denials." How to avoid speaking about denials is a very, very interesting question. So it connects the notion of speech, the notion of denial, and this is definitely a very, very political question. And my point is how to connect these political questions and its ideological dimension with neuroscience. That is one question. You can take two or three, and then you can answer. And then another thing related to this, I was just wondering as I was listening to your talk, because I have been reading about entanglement and neuroscience for some time, and I always wondered about what kind of dialogue or connection we can have possibly with Deleuze's notion of assemblage, which is a very, very political term, like entanglement in brain, which is apparently a non-political, biologically rooted neural activity, which can be biased, quote unquote biased. You mentioned the term bias, a very important term, I think, in the negative sense, but also how we can repoliticize it and think of the neurological activity as a possibility for assemblage. I know that two terms are very, very different, and they're also spoken in different contexts. Assemblage is a political term where the minority thinking comes together. The women, the nomad, the children, the excluded, they form a loose assemblage, unlike the bigger networks of nation state. So how you relate this notion of the assemblage with the notion of entanglement? You can take these two perhaps, and then we can proceed with that.
Yes. Excellent questions, brother. Excellent questions. Obviously, you're a Derrida scholar. I haven't specifically read that particular essay that you mentioned, but I'm aware of the work. I'm aware of the sentiment that Derrida is trying to talk about in that particular essay. So we know in cultural studies that every act of communication is political. So, and the brain, the moment the brain happens as a neural phenomenon, as an electrochemical phenomenon, the brain is simultaneously a situated brain. And one particular theorist I find interesting, I have mentioned him as well as Andy Clark. And Andy Clark's notion of a situated brain is interesting, because I think that's exactly what he is saying, what you're talking about over here. The brain as an electrochemical phenomenon, the brain as a cognitive phenomenon, but the brain as a simultaneously situated phenomenon. So the inside-outside loop begins to get really interestingly entangled together. The brain as something which is cognizing reality and consuming reality through an embedded process, which is neural, it's inside the brain, but also equally to an extended process, an enactive process. So the 4 E's of cognition by Clark is interesting: extended, embodied, enactive, and enactive, extended, embodied, and embedded. Yes, anyway. So the 4 E's of cognition are very, very important, and how we encode information. Because, if you look at the brain, and this is a very pertinent question, and this is what I meant at the end of my session, that we should not be too seduced by neuroscience, looking at from this particular perspective, because that is perfectly possible, that we have this fancy labs and the lovely neuroscientists working on magnificent codes and the scientific experiments, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, we need to be honest about our location as a discipline in this particular episteme. We need to be honest and candid about, and proud also about our location as literary people, as critical theorists, because I think the time has come when the dialogue has become more symmetrical, right? It's not really asymmetrical anymore, because even they are looking at literature, even they're looking at literary studies in terms of a more nuanced understanding of the mind. And why is the mind suddenly so hot in neuroscience, right? There are scientists writing on the mind. I mean, Marcio has got a book called The Self Comes to Mind. I mean, can you believe it? It's a hardcore neuroscientist who might win a Nobel Prize someday, and is writing a book which is called The Self Comes to Mind. I mean, the self, the mind, what are we talking about? These are very philosophical terms, right? So I think the dialogue between neuroscience and literature and philosophy is becoming more symmetric, and that's a very optimistic thing. I'm very optimistic about the symmetry of those dialogues. So we don't really have to sort of be desperate in terms of clinging on to neuroscience. And I can personally say that I had a desperation at the beginning of my PhD, and my supervisor shot it down very quickly, very brutally, much to my advantage later. So she very clearly told me that, it's perfectly possible to be seduced and read, lab experiments and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, we need to be aware of our epistemic location as literary scholars and as cultural theorists. So just to answer your question, I think the idea of the situated brain is becoming big in neuroscience today. And that sort of connects very interestingly in a very complex way. Again, and this is where Deleuze comes in as well, the whole idea of assemblage. And Deleuze is a very fine figure for this, because it talks about sort of capitalism, schizophrenia, data formation, rhizome. Because, that metaphor, the rhizome, it can, I was talking about the mad metaphor the other day in a session. A metaphor that can consume endless metaphors, right? So there's this rhizomatic quality about the rhizome as a metaphor, right? It can mean anything. It can also unmean anything, right? It can spread like capitalism, and at the same time, it can keep revising itself. So I was talking about the virus, the COVID-19 virus, some kind of a rhizome. It keeps mutating itself in a way that it becomes a mad metaphor of so many other things. So I think Deleuze is a very crucial figure in terms of an understanding of sort of the brain, the sick brain, and also the cultural matrices that produce sickness and consume sickness. In the same way as Malibu is. And I'm sure you've read Malibu's works on plasticity and the ontology of the accident. Because the whole idea of the accident as an interruption, which is obviously cognitive. It happens through trauma, through injury, etc. But also it is quite experiential, and in that sense, it's quite extended. So our consumption of discursive reality is interrupted in some sense. Our consumption of language is interrupted in some sense. I mean, we can think of something as basic, forgive me for using the word basic, but something as classic as Mrs. Dalloway is a very fine example. So we have a PTSD veteran coming back from the war. He had gone to the war with a certain kind of masculinity, and he comes back from the war as an exhausted man, and he cannot connect to reality, right? So his problem, the problem of Septimus Smith and Mrs. Dalloway, is obviously neural, it is inside, but also he fails to connect to anything around him. And that is a very discursive thing. So I think you're completely right in terms of looking at deludes in terms of looking at Derrida. But my only caveat, and this is something I've shared with you personally before, is that people like us in this field, and I do hold myself accountable as well, we should not be too seduced by the carrots of neuroscience to a certain extent, which are dangling before us. We must robustly locate ourselves as critical theorists, and we must come to neuroscience through critical theory, and not the other way around, I think.
Thank you, Abhishek. I think this point that you made about the symmetry and the ability of the critical theory, philosophy, and humanities to talk back and relate to the hard, quote unquote, hard sciences actually collapses the kind of scientism which we encourage in often encourage in our system of knowledge, and that is basically, I should pronounce it clearly, that is basically my purpose to organize this talk, and I think that I've been successful. So getting into some further questions, questions are coming, but then I take the privilege of being the host and ask another one or two questions which I think is pertinent and we can know more about this from you. One is the way, now you talked about the unmappability of mind, which is a very, very important point. And while there is the unmappability of the mind, the market, the economy, it tries to map the mind in a certain sense. I was reading the book by Bang Chul Han, the Chinese scholar, who talked about, the name of his book is Psychopolitics. There is a subtitle, I don't remember. But psychopolitics as a notion which overcomes the notion of the biopolitics. Psychopolitics as the mechanism to control and map our mind. So how do you think of this kind of determinability in terms of the neurological thinking? And connected to this, do you think that fiction actually has the ability to question this apparent unmediatedness? And fiction, you talked about the media, which is the media, the word you use is very, very important and pertinent here, because media is something which we become more conscious while reading fiction. When we think about the hard sciences, it is more transparent. But when we read fiction, we always remember the unrememberability or the dismembering quality of our thinking. So the mediatedness is, and that is very pertinent even in the age of the digital media, giving the interest in digital humanities that attracts both of us, and the virtual world in which we live. So that is the last question. After that, I will ask whatever has come from the audience.
Very pertinent things. Exactly what I meant. The risk of reification, as I mentioned, the risk of very reductionist thinking. And as you correctly pointed out, the whole idea of psychopolitics. And I can mention something which sounds even more strange. There's actually a domain of knowledge called neuroeconomics, right? And neuroeconomics is sort of looking at decision-making as a neural phenomenon and how that connects to broader institutions such as share market, such as investing in stocks, and how the neural behavior of the consumer becomes sort of a macro phenomenon in some sense. So again, the attempt, as you very correctly pointed out, the attempt is to map human behavior. That is to sort of make it some sort of formulaic activity. That, if you're neurally this way, then you'll behave that way. So you buy these stocks, you'll buy these shares, you'll buy X shares if you're neurally in a Y position. So it's very mathematical in a certain sense, and obviously that is the problem, and that is exactly why the unmappability of fiction as a medium becomes interesting. Because as you correctly pointed out, there's a lot of work done on fiction, but I think we need to also pay some attention on fiction as a medium. We keep talking about cinema as a medium. We keep talking about digital space as a medium. But there has been very few works, and I can't think of anything at the moment top of my head, perhaps as you can or other people can, on a very serious work on looking at fiction as a medium. And what is it that attracts us as a medium of fiction? And as I correctly pointed out, one advantage or one complexity perhaps that fiction has is that it is very metacognitive in quality, right? So when you're consuming fiction, you're aware of the consumption process as well. And fiction offers you that metacognitive quality to a certain extent. So when you open Gen I, when you open David Copperfield, when you begin to read it, you're aware of the immersive process, right? Because you're aware of you consuming. So there is an added dimension about you looking at yourself, reading the book, right? Or reading that fiction. So that metacognitive quality is, I think, what makes fiction such a fluid and complex phenomenon, that complex activity in a certain sense. So I think we need to pay more attention to the ontology of fiction as a medium, the experience of fiction as a medium, fiction as an affective medium. What does it do to us in terms of affective understanding of reality? And also, I mean, if you think in a very basic way, and this is a question that I sometimes ask to students, so why is it that fiction books get banned, right? So why take Satanic Verses seriously? Why take Ulysses seriously? So what is the seriousness that we need to give to fiction? So, institutions which ban fiction, they're actually quite aware of the metacognitive quality of fiction, that sometimes that maybe that we haven't tapped sufficiently. Right? So the whole politics of banning fiction is because we are looking at, while reading a book of fiction, we are aware of our consuming a certain kind of knowledge. So we're looking at ourselves also consuming that knowledge. And that can be subversive, right? There's an immediate subversive quality in fiction, which I argue comes to the metacognitive quality. So again, this goes back to your first question. The cognitive and the subversive, the embedded and the extended are connected categories. Right? So, and because if you think about it in a very rational institutional sense, what is a big deal about Ulysses? What is a big deal about Lady Chapter's lover? I mean, it's not claiming to be real. It's not claiming to be a documentary of anything. It's not claiming to be a reflection of anything. It's fiction. So what is it about the medium which makes it so subversive? And my argument is, at least from where I stand today, in my very modest scholarship on the subject, my argument is the subversive lies in a metacognitive, right? And that is an area we need to tap into, the metacognitive quality of fiction. We are sort of aware of our understanding of reality through fiction. We are looking at ourselves as people reading a book. And that metacognitive quality, the cognition of cognition, is what makes fiction perhaps a very immediately subversive medium. So that would be my response to your question.
Thank you, Abhishek. You just remembered me. I was reading Derrida's The Eye of the University, where he was talking about to see the scene.
Yeah,
to see the scene. So again, there are overlaps with Derrida. It continuously overlaps and relates and entangles with the other fields and other disciplines. Being a Derrida fan again, as you have already claimed me to be so.
I'm saying so it's like Hamlet's father, right? He never goes away. He's always there.
Yeah. So I will just ask a few questions from what has come from the audience. One is, Pavel, please highlight the questions. The last but one question by Sakshi Srivastav. Please. Okay. Pavel, can you highlight on the screen by Sakshi Srivastav? Yeah. What do you think of the temporal disruptions of memory due to illnesses like dementia, as often appropriated in the temporal flexibility in fiction for the sake of poetic justice of some kind?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's a very fine question. So this is exactly why fiction is such an ambivalent medium. I think we need to be, this is a very good question, because I think what Sakshi is, if I understand it correctly, where is the moral quality of fiction? If you're looking at something like dementia, which is obviously a very serious illness, and if you're sort of stylizing it, just because you happen to have a particular fictional medium, you can play around with it, you have stream of consciousness, you have vocalization, etc. So, fiction will offer you the flexibility to stylize dementia. So is it really, is it a moral activity, I think? And that's a very serious question, I think. The temporal disruption of memory due to illness as often appropriated, and I'm very interested in the word appropriation in fiction. And this is exactly the point of the medium. We need to look at fiction as a very open-ended medium. Again, so if there's one risk of reification from one end, like we also do in neuroscience, etc., there's the other risk of reification as well. So we are sort of seduced by abstractions. We are seduced by the innate morality of fiction. Fiction is amoral, I think. That is my very basic argument. Fiction doesn't have morality. Fiction shouldn't have morality, I think. So the amorality of fiction is something which needs to foreground and flag up very, very clearly. And that's exactly what Sakshi is asking, I think. So when you appropriate, and obviously appropriation is an act of consumption, you're taking that, you're making that a commodity. So we have a very serious illness like dementia. And how do you appropriate that? By stylizing it in fiction. Just because it's a fluid medium, it gives you the flexibility to stylize it to a certain extent. So how moral is that? Is that a right act? Is that a correct act? So my response to that would be, this is exactly why we need to look at fiction as an ambivalent activity, right? It is amoral. It is profoundly amoral, it's profoundly complex, and it can just offer you possibilities, I think. And this is, again, my basic principle definition of fiction, as a production of possibilities, right? Which can be amoral, moral, profoundly amoral, and perhaps all together, right? So my response to that would be, again, to go back to the earlier thing that we're discussing, we need to be aware of the other risk of reification in fiction. Right? Fiction as a moral mapping. We should not allow ourselves to sort of go in that direction as well. But the temporal disjunctions of memory, and this is where, to a certain extent, Malibu talks about that as well, in terms of how the fracture of an event, the disjunction, the sort of post-temporal quality is something that, fiction can offer in terms of, and she talks about Kafka's Metamorphosis as a very fine example of that. Right, how there's a sort of temporal disjunction, a temporality, a temporal order comes to an end, and we have a new temporal order coming, and how there's a fictional template that is there in Kafka's Metamorphosis. And Kafka is amoral, I think. Kafka is profoundly amoral. Kafka's fiction has no morality, right? So we need to be aware of the amorality of fiction. I think that's also part of the complexity of the medium, the amorality of fiction. So that would be my response to a really good question by Sakshi. Thank you for that.
Again, thanks. And Abhishek, can you please pronounce your email ID? There are some questions on, the suggestions for reading and etc. Then you can respond them later over the mail, because we are not going to read them. Can you please pronounce your email ID once? Then we can ask the other question. Abhishek, your mic, just switch on the mic. Just tell your email ID.
Yeah. I just said I typed my email in the chat box, but my email ID is very simple. It is my name, Abhishek Parvi, at iitm.ac.in. Or you can also email me at abhishekparvi@gmail.com. Just my name, all small letters, at gmail.com. Or my work email, which is iitm.ac.in.
Ask one or two questions.
So, Shomrata, can I make a request?
Yeah.
Can we have one final question? Because I'm in my office and I need to drive.
Sure. I'll just ask one final question and then wrap up. So this is a question by Srimohi Chattopadhyay on diasporic characters. Just as the diasporic characters are forced to consciously forget their past in order to survive and continue with their present and eventually their future. So it's I think it's a cryptic question.
Yes. I can see it. If you consider memory in the context of diaspora narratives, can memory be symbolized with the figure of a two-faced Janus, as the diasporic characters are forced to consciously forget their past in order to survive and continue with the present and eventually their future. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So this is a very classic example of the memory of the future, right? The future that can happen. So, the whole idea of the diasporic identity is a very complex combination of nostalgia and aspiration, as we all know. There's a very strong aspirational quality about any diasporic identity. So there's a very nostalgic quality about the identity, and equally there's an aspirational quality. There's a forward-looking quality about memory as well. And in that quality of forward-lookingness. I mean, it's a terrible term, please ignore it. But in that quality of forward-lookingness, we have the idea of conscious oblivion, a deliberate oblivion. And again, if you look at Kundera, I mean, I find Kundera is a very fertile field for this kind of work. So we have grandmothers who don't want to talk about communism. We have, older generations of people who just refuse to talk about that at all. And they're very consciously trying to forget in that sense. No one talks about certain things. It is sort of unofficially banned. And the whole idea of not talking about that, not discussing that, is obviously an idea, a strategy to sort of obliterate it. Now, just to come back to a hardcore psychological perspective on this, there's one theorist, one psychologist that I think is a bit understudied, but I think we need to go back to that figure and dig him up a little bit. Is a figure called Pierre Janet, Janet. Now, Janet was a person who coined the term traumatic memory. It wasn't Freud. So he was a contemporary of Freud, but obviously he got overshadowed by the more famous Freud. But I've got nothing against Freud, but I think Janet is someone who we need to look at as well. Now, interestingly, Janet defines two kinds of memories in this particular context that Shuman Chakrabarty has asked. So Janet talks about traumatic memory and, interestingly, narrative memory, right? And he talks about the transition of traumatic memory into narrative memory, and sometimes how traumatic memory may not become narrative memory. And this is obviously a brain decision. This is obviously a biased decision that I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to convert that into a narrative, but also it can be a collective decision. I think this is what the question is trying to look at. The trauma of mobility, the trauma of migration, the experience of dislocation, can we get rid of it by not talking about it, right? So can we refuse the transition into narrative memory? So again, if you go back to something like as popular as, let's say, Maus by Art Spiegelman, which is about the Holocaust narrative, and writing a graphic novel about the Holocaust, right? So that itself, the medium is very important over here. We were writing a comic book on the Holocaust, right? And in that, there's one particular scene where, Artie Spiegelman, who is the writer in the novel, he goes to his father, Vladek, and he's trying to interview him. And the father does not want to talk about it. And this refusal of the traumatic memory into becoming narrative memory, because mind you, narrative memory is a commodity, isn't it? The moment you make that into a narrative, you can make that into a commodity which can be sold, which can be consumed endlessly. So that refusal is also an agentic refusal to a certain extent. I don't want my trauma to become a narrative to a certain extent. I refuse the shape of the narrative. And I think we need to go back to someone like Pierre Janet, who makes a very clear distinction. And this is something which is original because Freud never talks about that at all. There's nowhere in Freud, at least my reading of Freud, he never talks about these two kinds of memory at all. But Janet is very clearly telling that for traumatic memory to become narrative memory, it must be a conscious process of recollection, and we can connect it back to the idea of chunking. We need to chunk in certain information and chunk out certain information. And that becomes a very deliberate choice, a very micro choice, a very agentic choice, and equally a communal choice to a certain extent, a cultural choice, a demographic choice to a certain extent. I think if you read Kundera, the book of Laughter and Forgetting, so how forgetting becomes an act of production in Kundera is not an absence at all. Forgetting is produced through certain rituals. Grandmothers don't talk about these things. So again, not talking obviously makes it into some kind of productive activity, the production of forgetting. So I think it's a very, very good question. That is something which interests me personally as well.
Abhishek, big clap for you. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. You were on fire. Literally, you were on fire today. I heard one or two of your presentations before in recent times. So thank you very much for this excellent presentation that you made. I just want to wrap up by thanking, giving a short thank giving of just 1 minute, then we can break. I thank Shammilani Mahavidyalaya for allowing us to organize this event, the Department of English, our principal, Dr. Shantiranjan Pal Chaudhuri, without whose inspiration this event would not have been a possibility, the coordinator of IQAC, Professor Ruma Chakraborty, Department of Bengali. She was present there in the first session because we have collaborated with the IQAC, Internal Quality Assurance Cell. I thank my departmental colleagues the senior most faculty member, Professor Mamata Sarkar, Professor Parthopratim Roy Chaudhary, who is still there with us. Pavel, can we see you? Please, can you please switch on your video? We want to see your face, my dear colleagues. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, we are back.
Meg Boron, yeah. Meg Boron is not here with us now. He has just presented Abhishek. Maybe he's busy. But I thank Meg Boron Haiti. And of course, the man behind the show, Pavel Mani, without whose assistance, nothing would have been possible. A big hand for Pavel. Thank you very much. You are the main person behind the show. And last but not the least, of course, the most important people who made this event successful, our speakers, Professor Devashish Banerjee and Professor Anirban Das from first day, Professor Onushtub Basu, and here with us, Professor Abhishek Paroi, today, the second day. And a small announcement is that we are going to continue this lecture series. This is not a seminar, not a webinar. This is a kind of orientation in critical theory, philosophy, and crossing the boundaries of humanities for a larger audience, so that the new system of knowledge, new ways of doing humanities can excite you. Thank you very much. Big hand to all of you.
I think I would also like to say that a big thank is due to Dr. Shomrat Sengupta for organizing this. He's the life force behind everything over here. So thank you, Shomrat.
Life force.
So we can break.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can break. Yeah. Bye. Thank you.